Arthur lowered the phone from his ear and stared at the dark screen until the display finally timed out and faded to black. The silence in his Denver kitchen suddenly felt thick enough to suffocate him. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left in a house that felt entirely empty and stripped of its warmth. He looked down at his hands resting heavily on the edge of the cold granite island. His knuckles were still pale and rigid from his intense grip on the counter. He glanced down at the faded blue denim shirt he was wearing and felt his chest tighten. It was the exact shirt he had worn just 3 months ago when he spent 4 backbreaking weekends sanding and staining the custom wooden counters for Apex roasters. Every blister he endured and every splinter he pulled from his fingers was a badge of pride for a father who only wanted to help his son build a solid future. Now that familiar fabric felt like a heavy lead weight draped across his tired shoulders. He was good enough to sweat over the dusty floorboards, and he was good enough to breathe in the noxious fumes of industrial wood sealant. He was certainly good enough to pull tens of thousands of dollars from his retirement accounts when the city permits took longer than expected and the primary contractor threatened to walk off the job completely. But he was not an important person. The vicious words echoed in the quiet space around him like a cruel and rhythmic chant. Only important people. Arthur slowly turned off the kitchen light and walked with heavy steps into the living room. He sat down in his worn leather armchair by the large bay window and looked out at the streetlights casting long and lonely shadows over the frost-covered lawns of his neighborhood. His late wife Eleanor had bought that chair for him exactly 10 years ago when his knees first started aching from decades of walking concrete construction sites. She used to sit on the floral sofa across from him holding her tea and tell him that Marcus just needed a little more time to find his footing in the world. She always believed their boy would eventually grow into a strong and independent man who understood the value of hard work and family loyalty. Arthur closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the cool leather headrest. He felt a deep and profound ache radiate through his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with his age or his physical health. It was the crushing and undeniable realization that he had not been raising a man at all. He had been blindly funding a grown child who viewed his father as nothing more than an automatic teller machine with a heartbeat. Marcus had stood in that crowded room full of laughing strangers and allowed his wife to banish his own father from the proudest moment of his professional life. The night stretched on in an agonizing and sleepless crawl. Arthur did not turn on the television to drown out the quiet, and he did not pick up a book to distract his mind. He simply sat in the dark and let the painful memories wash over him in relentless cold waves. He remembered the crisp autumn day Marcus first came to him with the glossy business plan for the upscale coffee shop. The boy had been practically vibrating with nervous energy and grand visions of success. Arthur had felt a massive surge of immense pride seeing that rare spark of ambition in his son. He had gladly written the first massive check for $20,000 to secure the prime corner lease in the downtown district. He remembered Chloe standing right next to Marcus with her sweet rehearsed smiles and empty promises that Arthur would always be their silent partner and their most honored guest. He remembered every single panicked phone call over the last 3 years when the imported espresso machines broke down or the commercial plumbing failed right before a busy weekend. Every single time Arthur had rushed to his bank and transferred the required funds without a second thought or a single demand for repayment. He had willingly sacrificed his own peace of mind and the comfortable quiet retirement he and Eleanor had meticulously planned together. He had traded his golden years to build a luxurious golden cage for a son who did not respect him enough to send an invitation. As the long hours ticked slowly past midnight, the initial physical shock of the betrayal began to fade away into the shadows. The stinging numbness in his chest was gradually replaced by a terrible and crystalline clarity. Arthur watched the pale moon drift behind the thick winter clouds over the distant Rocky Mountains outside his window. He realized with absolute certainty that the grand opening was not just a careless oversight or a simple scheduling misunderstanding. It was a cold and calculated exclusion. Chloe had orchestrated the entire evening to ensure the optics of their trendy new business were perfectly curated for the cameras. An aging widower in a faded denim work shirt simply did not fit the modern aesthetic she so desperately wanted to project to her wealthy investors and her shallow internet influencers. Marcus had allowed it to happen because it was far easier to betray his aging father than to stand up to his demanding wife. Arthur felt a single hot tear slip down his weathered cheek and drop onto his collar. It was not a tear of anger or spite, but a tear of deep and overwhelming mourning. He was mourning the relationship he thought he had with his only child and grieving the illusions he had harbored for decades. He let himself cry quietly in the dark for the boy he had completely lost to arrogance and boundless greed. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the living room blinds, the tears had stopped entirely. Arthur sat up straight in his chair and took a deep, steadying breath of the cool morning air. An entirely new sensation settled over him like a heavy suit of iron armor. It was a cold and unbreakable resolve. The era of his blind generosity was officially over, and the time for absolute consequences had finally arrived. The darkness of the early morning hours pressed heavily against the frost-covered windows of the Denver home as Arthur Pendleton slowly rose from his worn leather armchair. His joints ached with the familiar stiffness of a man who had spent 40 years walking uneven construction sites, but his mind was running with an uncharacteristic and frantic clarity. He did not retreat to his bedroom to seek a futile sleep. Instead, he walked down the quiet hallway toward the small study at the back of the house. This room had always belonged to his late wife Eleanor, and it still held the faint, comforting scent of her lavender soap and old books. He stepped over the threshold and approached the heavy oak desk she had purchased at an antique market decades ago. It was the desk where they had sat side by side to balance their modest checkbook and plan their retirement. Arthur reached into his pocket and produced a small brass key. He knelt beside the bottom drawer and unlocked it with a sharp metallic click. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy gray metal lockbox. The cold steel felt grounding against his warm palms. He carried the box to the surface of the desk and clicked on the small brass reading lamp. The warm yellow light spilled across the polished wood and illuminated the quiet battlefield of his financial ruin. Arthur opened the lid of the lockbox and breathed in the dry scent of aging paper. Inside lay 3 years of meticulously folded bank statements and wire transfer receipts alongside desperate scribbled notes taken during frantic phone calls. He reached into the top drawer of the desk and retrieved a fresh yellow legal pad and a dark blue ink pen. Arthur was a retired structural engineer who had spent his entire career calculating load-bearing weights and stress fractures. He understood exactly how much pressure a foundation could take before it inevitably collapsed. Now he was going to calculate the exact weight of his son's greed. He uncapped the pen and began his methodical audit of the Apex Roasters illusion. He started at the very beginning with the crisp receipt from the initial $20,000 deposit required to secure the prime corner lease in the downtown district. He carefully wrote the date and the amount on the top line of the yellow paper. His handwriting was precise and unwavering. He turned to the next stack of papers and continued pulling the painful memories into the harsh light of reality. He documented the exorbitant fees he had paid for expedited city permits when Marcus failed to file the proper paperwork on time and panicked at the prospect of a delayed launch. He listed the staggering cost of the imported Italian espresso machines that suddenly broke down right before the holiday rush because Chloe had flatly refused to pay for routine maintenance. He recorded month after month of sudden rent shortfalls and frantic payroll emergencies where Marcus had pleaded for just one more bridge loan to keep the dream afloat. Arthur wrote down the cost of the custom patio heaters and the artisan lighting fixtures and the reclaimed wood tables he had sanded with his own 2 hands. Every single line item represented a moment he truly believed he was being a supportive and loving father. Every single number represented a moment they had looked at him and seen nothing more than a convenient and endless supply of untraceable wealth. The hours slipped away as the stack of receipts dwindled and the long column of numbers grew down the length of the yellow page. The silence of the house was broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the rhythmic scratching of the pen against the paper. Arthur drew a thick, solid line beneath the final entry. He performed the final calculation twice to ensure his engineering mind had not made a mistake. The total stared back at him in stark blue ink. $54,200. It was a staggering sum carved directly out of the retirement savings he and Eleanor had sacrificed their entire youth to build. It was the money meant to pay for their quiet twilight years and their medical care. Instead, it had been completely drained to fund the luxurious lifestyle for two adults who could not even bear to have him stand in the same room as their wealthy investors. $54,200 was the exact price of his own erasure. Arthur set the pen down gently on the desk and leaned back in Eleanor's chair. A profound and physical wave of cathartic grief washed over him so fiercely it stole the breath from his lungs. He did not yell at the empty room and he did not throw the heavy metal lockbox against the wall. He simply covered his face with his large calloused hands and wept. He wept for the sweet little boy who used to follow him around the garage asking to hold the flashlight. He mourned the terrible loss of the honorable man he had desperately tried to raise. He cried for the deep humiliation of realizing his unconditional love had been weaponized against him by his own flesh and blood. He allowed the sorrow to completely shatter the illusions he had clung to for the past 3 years. He let the painful truth of his exploitation settle deep into his soul until there were simply no more tears left to shed. When Arthur finally lowered his hands, the first soft rays of morning light were piercing through the study window. The tears had dried tightly against his weathered skin, leaving behind a face carved from absolute stone. The overwhelming grief that had consumed him just an hour before had crystallized into something entirely different. It had hardened into a dense and impenetrable armor. He looked down at the yellow legal pad and felt a cold and unbreakable resolve settle into his bones. The endless well of his generosity had finally run completely dry. He folded the piece of paper precisely in half and slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt. He closed the metal lockbox and returned it to the bottom drawer. The boundaries were finally drawn and the foundation was set. Arthur stood up from the desk and walked toward the front door, knowing exactly what he had to do the moment the bank opened its doors. Arthur walked out into the biting chill of the early Denver morning and climbed into the cab of his weathered pickup truck. The engine turned over with a familiar heavy rumble that usually brought him a sense of grounded comfort. Today, he simply put the vehicle into gear and pulled out of his driveway with a singular and unshakable focus. The city streets were still mostly empty as he navigated toward the financial district. The morning sun was just beginning to cast a pale golden glow over the glass facades of the downtown buildings. Arthur parked his truck in the sprawling lot of his local bank branch exactly 15 minutes before the heavy glass doors were scheduled to open. He sat in the quiet cab with his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel and the folded yellow legal pad tucked securely inside his breast pocket. He did not feel any lingering hesitation or residual guilt over the monumental decision he was about to execute. The $54,200 he had tallied just hours ago was a ghost haunting his retirement, and he was finally ready to perform the exorcism. When the security guard finally turned the lock on the front doors, Arthur stepped out into the crisp air and walked inside with the steady posture of a man walking into battle. The interior of the bank smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished marble. Arthur walked directly to the receptionist's desk and requested an immediate meeting with the branch manager. Mr. David Sterling was a polished man in his early 50s who had personally handled the Pendleton accounts for over a decade. Sterling stepped out of his glass-enclosed office with a warm and practiced smile, extending his hand in a gesture of familiar camaraderie. He had been the one to process the massive initial wire transfer for Apex Roasters 3 years ago and had heartily commended Arthur for being such an incredibly supportive and generous father. Today, that memory tasted like bitter ash in Arthur's mouth. He shook the manager's hand firmly and followed him into the quiet office, closing the door behind them. Sterling settled into his high-backed leather chair and asked how the grand opening of the coffee shop had gone the night before. Arthur looked at the man directly in the eyes and stated plainly that he had not been invited because the event was strictly reserved for important people. The warm smile completely vanished from Sterling's face as a heavy and uncomfortable silence descended upon the small room. Arthur reached into his pocket and placed the folded yellow legal pad squarely in the center of the mahogany desk. Without raising his voice or showing even a fraction of the profound grief he had processed through the night, Arthur issued his strict instructions. He requested a complete and immediate severance of every single financial tether connecting his personal assets to the Apex Roasters business accounts. Sterling opened his computer terminal and began navigating through the tangled web of joint liabilities Arthur had foolishly woven over the past 3 years. Arthur ordered the manager to cancel the monthly automatic transfer that quietly moved $800 from his pension account into Marcus's operating fund to cover the perpetual rent shortfalls. He watched the manager click his mouse and sever the digital artery forever. Next, Arthur instructed Sterling to completely dissolve the overdraft protection plan that was currently set to drain his personal emergency savings the moment the coffee shop account dipped into the negative. That particular safety net had saved Chloe from bouncing vendor checks more times than Arthur cared to remember. Finally, Arthur demanded to be completely removed as the personal guarantor on the primary business line of credit. He signed the heavy stack of release forms with steady and deliberate strokes of his pen, legally binding the business debt solely to the son who had accumulated it. With every single signature, Arthur felt a massive phantom weight lift from his tired shoulders. Sterling gathered the signed documents and tapped them neatly against the surface of his desk. He looked at Arthur with an expression of deep professional concern mixed with genuine personal sympathy. He gently warned his longtime client that the Apex Roasters accounts were currently hovering dangerously close to empty and that removing these vital protections would trigger an immediate financial crisis for the young couple. The manager explained that without the overdraft shield and the monthly cash injection, the business would likely bounce its payroll checks before the end of the week. He cautioned Arthur that Marcus and Chloe would fall incredibly hard and incredibly fast without their established safety net. Arthur absorbed the dire warning without a single flinch or waver of his quiet resolve. He leaned forward slightly and told the manager that for 3 years he had served as their endless backup plan, and it had never once made them responsible or grateful. It had only made them arrogant and entitled while it slowly bled his retirement dry. Arthur calmly agreed with the manager's assessment and accepted the absolute reality of his choice. He stated quietly that gravity was an excellent teacher and it was finally time for his son to learn how to walk on his own 2 feet or suffer the natural consequences of the fall. Sterling nodded slowly in solemn understanding and finalized the paperwork. Arthur stood up from the comfortable chair feeling lighter and more protected than he had in years. He walked out of the bank and back into the bright Denver morning, ready to face the inevitable storm. Arthur stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the bank and took a deep breath of the crisp Denver air. The morning sun was climbing higher into the pale blue sky and warming the cold concrete beneath his boots. He climbed back into the cab of his weathered pickup truck and started the engine. Instead of turning right to merge onto the highway that would take him directly back to the quiet solitude of his suburban neighborhood, he engaged the left turn signal. A strange and quiet compulsion guided his hands on the steering wheel, pulling him toward the bustling heart of the lower downtown district. The streets of Lodo were already coming alive with the frantic energy of the morning rush. Men in sharply tailored suits and women in expensive cashmere coats hurried along the brick-paved sidewalks clutching their leather briefcases and designer bags. Arthur navigated his battered truck through the narrow historic streets, feeling entirely out of place among the luxury vehicles and the gentrified brick lofts, but he did not let the disparity rush him. He was not there to participate in the morning rush or to seek validation from the busy crowds. He was simply a man performing a final inspection on a structure he had financed but would never actually inhabit. He turned the corner onto the busy avenue and immediately spotted the gleaming matte black facade of Apex Roasters. Arthur pulled his truck into an empty loading zone across the street and put the transmission into park, leaving the engine idling with a low, steady rumble. He rolled down his window, letting the cold air wash over his face as he stared across the asphalt at the realization of his son's dream. The coffee shop was undeniably beautiful. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the warm amber glow of the artisanal Edison bulbs hanging above the long espresso bar. He recognized the rich dark grain of the reclaimed wood tables that he had spent countless weekend hours sanding and sealing until his hands were raw and blistered. Outside on the pristine sidewalk stood 4 towering copper patio heaters radiating a luxurious warmth into the freezing morning air. Arthur remembered writing the frantic check for $4,000 to cover those exact heaters when Chloe insisted they were absolutely crucial for attracting the elite winter clientele. He watched the endless stream of fashionable customers flowing in and out of the heavy glass doors carrying their expensive branded cups. It was a thriving monument to success built entirely upon the unseen and unacknowledged foundation of his own drained life savings. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and retrieved his smartphone. His calloused thumb tapped the screen as he opened the social media application he had downloaded months ago just to follow the progress of the shop. He typed the name of the business into the search bar and immediately found the official Apex Roasters page. The very first image on the glowing screen was a professionally edited gallery from the grand opening the night before. Arthur stared at the bright and joyful photograph of his son. Marcus was standing behind the gleaming espresso machine wearing a pristine canvas apron and smiling wider than Arthur had seen him smile in a decade. In the next photo, Chloe was posing in a sleek designer dress holding a crystal flute of champagne and laughing effortlessly with a group of wealthy local influencers. The final image was a wide group shot of Marcus and Chloe surrounded by dozens of beautiful and important people with their arms wrapped tightly around each other in a display of manufactured intimacy. Arthur slowly scrolled down to read the polished caption underneath the gallery. It read that they were incredibly blessed to celebrate their grand opening with their favorite people and their most vital supporters who made the dream a reality. There was absolutely no mention of the silent father who had quietly bankrolled the entire endeavor and sanded the very floors they were dancing on. Arthur sat alone in the cab of his truck and stared at the glowing screen until his eyes began to burn. A month ago, those images would have shattered his heart and sent him spiraling into a deep and questioning depression. He would have agonized over what he had done wrong and how he could possibly win back the affection of a son who clearly despised him. Today, he simply felt a cold and sterile closure. He looked at the artificial smiles and the calculated poses and finally recognized the absolute toxicity of the world they had chosen over him. They were 2 hollow people wearing expensive masks and funding their arrogant vanity with the quiet sacrifices of an old man they deemed too embarrassing to invite. Arthur tapped the menu icon on the corner of the screen and firmly pressed the button to permanently block their accounts. He watched the bright gallery vanish into a blank gray screen, severing the digital tether with the exact same finality he had used to sever the financial ones at the bank. He placed the phone back into his pocket and shifted the heavy truck into drive. As he merged back into the flow of the city traffic, the atmosphere inside the cab felt completely different. The echoing silence that had haunted him throughout the long sleepless night was entirely gone. The quiet in the truck was no longer hollow or lonely, but thick and dense and fiercely protective. He drove away from the trendy neighborhood without checking his rearview mirror, finally leaving the heavy ghosts of his toxic family behind him. For 2 entire days, the quiet suburban house felt like a sanctuary rather than a tomb. Arthur spent his hours reading in the sunlit living room and tending to the neglected winter maintenance around the property. He did not receive a single phone call or text message from his son, which only confirmed his deepest suspicions that their communication was entirely transactional. The peaceful solitude was finally shattered on a cold Thursday afternoon by a violent and rhythmic pounding on the heavy wooden front door. It was not the polite and hesitant knock of a neighbor or the respectful tap of a delivery driver. It was a sharp and demanding strike that echoed through the quiet hallway like a physical threat. Arthur set down his coffee mug on the kitchen counter and wiped his hands slowly on a dish towel. He felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he forced his breathing to remain slow and measured. He walked down the hall with the steady and deliberate steps of a man who knew exactly what monster was waiting on the other side of the wood. When he turned the brass handle and pulled the door open, he found Marcus and Chloe standing on his front porch looking like a pair of frantic and cornered animals. Marcus pushed his way across the threshold without waiting for an invitation or offering a single word of greeting. His hair was disheveled and his face was flushed with a mixture of panic and deep indignation. Chloe followed closely behind him, wearing a sharp designer coat and an expression of absolute fury. They stormed into the center of the living room and immediately began shouting over each other. Neither of them offered a single apology for the cruel exclusion at the grand opening or even acknowledged the emotional damage they had inflicted just days prior. Instead, Marcus aggressively demanded to know why the bank had suddenly frozen the business credit lines and canceled the automatic transfer protocols. He waved his smartphone in the air and frantically explained that their operating account was completely empty and they were scheduled to process payroll by the end of the week. Chloe stepped forward and crossed her arms tightly across her chest, staring at Arthur with cold and accusing eyes. She stated that they needed an immediate emergency transfer of $4,000 just to keep the lights on and pay the baristas they had hired for the weekend rush. She spoke with the sharp and condescending tone of a manager reprimanding a lazy employee who had failed to complete his assigned duties. Arthur stood perfectly still near the entryway and simply watched them unravel. He did not raise his voice to match their chaotic volume, and he did not offer a single excuse for his actions at the bank. The frantic energy they brought into his home washed over him like water breaking against a solid stone wall. He turned his back on their demands and walked calmly into the adjacent study. He retrieved the folded yellow legal pad from the surface of Eleanor's antique oak desk and walked back into the living room. He approached his son and held out the piece of paper without saying a word. Marcus snatched the pad with a huff of deep frustration and snapped it open, expecting to see a list of banking instructions or a new set of conditions for the loan. Instead, his eyes fell upon the meticulous column of dates and descriptions and the staggering final total written in stark blue ink. Marcus stared at the words $54,200, and the aggressive flush of anger immediately drained from his face, leaving him pale and completely speechless. He looked up at his father with wide and confused eyes, as if he were trying to comprehend a foreign language. Chloe snatched the yellow paper from her husband's trembling hands, and her eyes darted furiously over the itemized list. Her manicured nails dug into the edges of the page as she immediately began to rewrite the narrative to suit her own reality. She raised her chin and declared sharply that those expenses were family gifts and investments in their shared future. She insisted that Arthur had offered the money willingly and that bringing it up now was nothing more than a petty and manipulative tactic to punish them for a simple misunderstanding about the grand opening guest list. Arthur looked directly into her cold eyes and quietly corrected her. He stated that those payments were the heavy price of their arrogance and his own foolish blind loyalty. He told them that his retirement savings was not a venture capital fund and he was officially retiring from the position of their personal safety net. Chloe sneered and stepped closer into his personal space with her voice dropping to a vicious and venomous whisper. She promised him that if Apex Roasters collapsed and they lost everything they had worked for, the failure would rest entirely upon his shoulders. She swore that he would carry the heavy guilt of destroying his only son's life forever. The heavy threat hung in the quiet air of the living room, but it failed to find any purchase in Arthur's hardened heart. He looked at the two entitled adults standing in his home and felt absolutely nothing but a profound and weary pity. He did not argue with Chloe's twisted logic, and he did not try to convince Marcus of his deep paternal love. He simply pointed a steady, calloused finger toward the open front door. He told them in a voice as calm and cold as a frozen lake that they were grown adults who had wanted to play the role of successful entrepreneurs for all the important people in the city. Now it was finally time for them to pay the actual price of admission. He instructed them to leave his house immediately and to figure out their own payroll crisis without using his checkbook. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, opening his mouth as if he might finally offer a genuine apology or beg for a shred of mercy. But Chloe grabbed his arm roughly and pulled him toward the exit, marching out into the cold afternoon air without looking back. Arthur watched them walk down the driveway, and then he calmly pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying finality, echoing the profound closure in his own soul. The passing of 3 complete days brought an eerie and suffocating silence to the modest suburban home. Arthur expected a barrage of angry phone calls or a sudden influx of manipulative text messages from his son, but his phone remained completely quiet. The absence of their constant demands should have felt peaceful, but his decades of experience working on unpredictable construction sites had taught him to recognize the dangerous quiet that always precedes a structural collapse. He knew Marcus and Chloe were entirely out of money and completely desperate to make their upcoming payroll. Desperate people rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Arthur spent those 3 days maintaining a rigid schedule to keep his mind sharp and focused. He cleaned the gutters and organized his late wife Eleanor's garden tools and drank his black coffee by the front window while watching the street. He was mentally bracing himself for whatever retaliation they were planning, but he severely underestimated the sheer depths of their cruelty until the 4th morning arrived. The silence was finally broken just after 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning by the quiet hum of a high-performance engine. Arthur watched through the living room blinds as a sleek black luxury sedan pulled smoothly into his driveway. The expensive vehicle looked entirely out of place sitting next to his weathered pickup truck and the manicured working-class lawns of his neighborhood. The driver's side door opened and a man wearing a sharply tailored gray suit stepped out into the crisp morning air. He paused to button his jacket and adjust his silk tie before reaching into the passenger seat to retrieve a polished leather briefcase. He had the arrogant and practiced posture of a man who was used to intimidating people with his mere presence. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten deep in his stomach, but his face remained completely impassive. He did not wait for the stranger to walk up the path and ring the doorbell. He opened the heavy wooden front door and stepped out onto the concrete porch, standing tall with his broad shoulders squared against the morning chill. The man stopped at the base of the porch steps and offered a brilliantly white and entirely artificial smile. He introduced himself in a smooth and practiced baritone voice as Julian Vance. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a thick card announcing that he was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm representing the legal interests of Marcus and Chloe Pendleton. Arthur did not invite the lawyer inside the house to offer him a cup of coffee. He stood his ground on the elevated porch and forced the expensive attorney to speak his piece while standing in the cold driveway. Vance cleared his throat and adopted a tone of deep and exaggerated sympathy. He explained that his clients were incredibly worried about Arthur and his sudden uncharacteristic behavior over the past week. The lawyer used carefully selected words like isolated and confused and vulnerable to paint a picture of an aging widower who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. He spoke to Arthur with the slow and patronizing cadence one might use to soothe a frightened child or a lost dog. Arthur listened to the rehearsed speech with absolute and unnerving stillness. He did not interrupt the lawyer, and he did not attempt to defend his own mental clarity. Vance opened his polished briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bonded paper. He held them out like a benevolent priest offering salvation. The lawyer explained that Marcus and Chloe simply wanted to protect Arthur from making any further catastrophic mistakes that might jeopardize his peaceful retirement. They were generously offering to step in and assume a voluntary financial guardianship over his entire estate. Vance promised that this simple legal arrangement would completely relieve Arthur of the heavy and confusing burden of managing his own banking accounts. Marcus would take over all the complex administrative duties to ensure his father was properly cared for and protected from his own erratic financial decisions. The sheer audacity of the proposal hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest, but his weathered face remained carved from solid granite. He looked at the thick stack of papers and immediately translated the polite legal terminology into the vicious underlying truth. His son was not trying to help him, and his daughter-in-law was not concerned about his well-being. They were trying to legally erase his autonomy as a human being. If they could convince a judge that Arthur was mentally incompetent, they would gain absolute and unrestricted access to his pension and his savings and the substantial equity he had built in his home. They would not just take the $54,200 they had already bled from him. They would take absolutely everything he owned by force. Guardianship meant he would not be able to write a single check or buy his own groceries or make his own medical decisions without begging for their permission. It meant he would become a legal infant entirely trapped under the absolute control of the two people who despised him the most. Arthur looked the lawyer directly in the eyes and firmly refused to take the documents. He stated quietly and evenly that he was not confused, and he was certainly not making erratic decisions. He explained that permanently cutting off the financial supply to a pair of entitled parasites was the absolute most lucid choice he had made in over 3 years. The polite and sympathetic smile vanished from the lawyer's face in an instant and was quickly replaced by a cold and calculating glare. Vance lowered the papers and softly warned Arthur that declining the voluntary option might leave his loving family with no other choice but to pursue a court-mandated psychiatric evaluation. The veiled threat hung heavy in the cold morning air, but Arthur did not flinch. He simply nodded his head once and told the man to get off his property immediately. He turned his back on the lawyer and walked inside, pushing the heavy wooden door shut. As the lock clicked securely into place, Arthur realized the terrifying reality of his situation. The confrontation over the coffee shop was completely over, but the true war for his life and his freedom had just begun. Arthur stood in a quiet hallway listening to the faint sound of the luxury sedan pulling away from his curb. He did not allow the cold fear that Julian Vance had tried to instill to take root in his mind. He knew that panic was the exact reaction they were hoping to provoke. He walked straight into Eleanor's old study and opened his laptop on the oak desk. He immediately began searching for legal representation specializing in elder abuse and aggressive financial coercion. He spent nearly an hour reading through credentials and case histories until he found the name Sarah Jenkins. Her professional reputation painted a picture of a formidable and relentless litigator who did not tolerate the exploitation of her elderly clients under any circumstances. Arthur picked up his phone and called her office, firmly explaining the urgent nature of the veiled threat that had just been delivered to his doorstep. The receptionist recognized the absolute severity of the situation and managed to schedule an emergency consultation for that very afternoon. The law office of Sarah Jenkins was a stark contrast to the polished marble floors and artificial smiles of the downtown corporate firms. Her workspace was tucked away in a modest brick building and filled with towering stacks of manila folders and heavy legal volumes that smelled of old paper and serious work. Sarah was a sharp woman in her late 40s with piercing dark eyes and a practical demeanor that instantly put Arthur at ease. She did not wear an expensive silk suit or offer him rehearsed platitudes. He sat across from her sturdy wooden desk and presented the folded yellow legal pad alongside a detailed and emotionless recounting of the morning visit from the slick attorney. Sarah listened intently without interrupting while furiously scribbling notes on her own legal pad. When Arthur finally finished speaking, she leaned back in her chair and let out a heavy sigh of deep professional disgust. She confirmed his darkest suspicions without a single ounce of sugarcoating. She told him that his son and daughter-in-law were attempting a textbook and highly malicious case of elder financial exploitation. Sarah explained the terrifying reality of their legal strategy in cold and precise terms. She warned Arthur that Marcus and Chloe were deliberately trying to build a fabricated narrative of mental decline to force a guardianship petition through the probate courts. If they succeeded in tricking a judge, they would legally strip him of his autonomy and seize total absolute control over his entire estate. They would control his pension and his savings and the very house he was living in. Sarah looked Arthur directly in the eyes and commanded him to start treating this situation like an active and hostile war zone. She issued a strict set of absolute instructions that he was to follow without question. He was to document every single interaction in writing and refuse any private communication with his family and ignore their inevitable attempts to provoke an emotional reaction. Her final instruction was the most immediate and physical boundary he needed to establish before the day was over. She ordered him to go directly to a hardware store and change every single lock on his house before the sun went down. Arthur left the law office feeling a profound mixture of lingering dread and fierce empowerment. He drove his battered truck to the local hardware supply store on the edge of town. He walked down the brightly lit aisles, completely ignoring the decorative fixtures and heading straight for the heavy-duty security hardware. He meticulously selected 3 solid brass deadbolts with reinforced strike plates and heavy steel internal cores. The young clerk at the register cheerfully asked if he was remodeling his home for the upcoming winter season while scanning the items. Arthur offered a tight and polite smile, simply stating that he was making a few necessary upgrades to secure his foundation. He paid for the heavy metal locks in cash and carried them out to his truck, feeling the solid weight of the boxes against his chest. They were not just pieces of hardware meant to keep out common thieves. They were the literal and symbolic tools he desperately needed to reclaim the absolute sovereignty of his own life from the people who wanted to steal it. Arthur spent the late afternoon working methodically on his front porch. The familiar weight of his trusted screwdriver felt incredibly grounding in his calloused hands. He unscrewed the old brass faceplate and pulled the original deadbolt out of the heavy wooden door. This was the exact lock he had installed over 20 years ago to keep his family safe, and the exact same lock he had proudly given Marcus a key to when the boy first learned how to drive. Removing that rusted cylinder felt like tearing out a deep root that had anchored his heart for decades. He slid the new heavy steel core into the bored hole and tightened the mounting screws with deliberate and powerful turns of his wrist. He repeated the methodical process on the back door and the side garage entrance until the entire house was completely fortified against any unwanted intrusion. As the sun finally dipped below the Rocky Mountains and cast long purple shadows across his frost-covered lawn, Arthur stood alone in his quiet entryway. He reached out and turned the new brass thumb latch. He listened to the heavy steel bolt slide smoothly into the reinforced door frame with a deep and satisfying click. His son was officially locked out of his home and out of his life. The castle was finally secured and Arthur was ready for the siege. The crisp morning air settled over the quiet Denver neighborhood, bringing a deceptive sense of peace to Arthur Pendleton's fortified home. It had only been 48 hours since he had thwarted their pathetic attempt to shut off his electricity by fraudulently linking their failing business debts to his residential account. That cowardly utility sabotage had proven exactly what his attorney Sarah Jenkins had warned him about. They were actively probing his perimeter and searching for any structural weakness they could exploit. Arthur was standing in his kitchen pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee when a gentle and hesitant knock sounded at his heavy wooden front door. He approached the entryway cautiously and peered through the newly installed brass peephole. Standing on his porch was Martha Higgins. She was a retired schoolteacher who had lived 2 houses down for over 20 years and had frequently traded garden vegetables with his late wife Eleanor. Arthur unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt and opened the door to find Martha holding a small plate covered in clear plastic wrap. Martha offered a warm and sympathetic smile as she handed him the plate of freshly baked blueberry muffins. She stepped inside the warm entryway and nervously wiped her hands on her woolen cardigan. She admitted quietly that she had noticed the strange flurry of activity around his property lately, including the slick attorney in the luxury sedan and the aggressive utility workers. Arthur led her into the pristine kitchen and poured her a cup of coffee while offering a brief but honest explanation of the ongoing situation. He did not burden her with the exact financial figures, but he explained that he had finally cut off his financial support to Apex Roasters and his son was relentlessly retaliating. Martha listened with a deep and mournful sadness in her eyes before reaching out to gently pat his calloused hand. She lowered her voice and confessed that she had been carrying a heavy secret for several months. She told Arthur about the warm summer evenings when she used to sit on her porch and inadvertently listen to Marcus and Chloe arguing loudly in his driveway. Martha's voice trembled slightly as she revealed the exact cruel words she had overheard. She heard Chloe explicitly refer to Arthur as a senile cash cow, and she heard Marcus laughing in agreement while promising his wife that the old man would never notice the missing money. The vicious insult landed heavily in the quiet kitchen, but Arthur did not react with sudden anger or bitter tears. He simply thanked Martha for her honesty and her courage in bringing him the painful truth. The confirmation of their absolute disdain did not break his spirit, but merely added another thick layer of cold steel to his emotional armor. Martha finished her coffee and promised Arthur that if he ever needed a character witness or a friendly neighbor to watch his property, she would be absolutely ready to help. She left the house with a final comforting squeeze of his shoulder, leaving Arthur alone with the lingering scent of baked goods and the absolute certainty of his righteous path. He did not have long to ponder the cruel revelation. Less than 1 hour after Martha walked back down the street, another knock echoed through the quiet house. This knock was not gentle or hesitant. It was the firm and authoritative strike of law enforcement. Arthur looked through the front window and saw a marked Denver police cruiser idling in his driveway. He took a deep and steadying breath before unlocking the front door to greet the 2 uniformed officers standing on his porch. The lead officer was a tall and broad-shouldered man who introduced himself as Officer Ramirez. He spoke with a professional and carefully neutral tone, explaining that the department had received an urgent and anonymous phone call requesting an immediate wellness check on the residents. The anonymous caller had frantically reported that an elderly man was living in extreme squalor and suffering from severe dementia and was completely isolated from his loving family. Arthur listened to the fabricated accusations with a stoic and unwavering expression. He did not raise his voice in indignation, and he did not attempt to frantically defend his sanity. He simply stepped back and swung the heavy wooden door wide open. He calmly invited the 2 police officers to step inside and inspect the premises for themselves. Officer Ramirez and his partner walked into the bright and immaculate living room. They immediately noticed the spotless hardwood floors and the neatly dusted furniture and the comforting smell of fresh coffee and blueberry muffins lingering in the air. Arthur led the completely bewildered officers down the hallway and straight into his organized study. He gestured toward the antique oak desk where his legal binders and bank statements were perfectly aligned in color-coded rows. He spoke in a clear and highly articulate manner as he explained the exact nature of the malicious phone call. He detailed his recent decision to completely sever his financial support for his son's failing coffee shop and outlined the aggressive retaliation tactics his family was currently deploying. He showed Officer Ramirez the official business card of his elder law attorney Sarah Jenkins and the documented proof of the fraudulent utility shutoff request from earlier in the week. He presented the entire situation with the cold and precise logic of a veteran structural engineer explaining a collapsed bridge. The professional neutrality on Officer Ramirez's face rapidly dissolved into a profound and visible disgust. He looked around the pristine home and then looked directly at the sharp and completely lucid man standing before him. The officer realized instantly that his department was being weaponized by a greedy family attempting to build a fabricated paper trail of mental incompetence. Ramirez closed his small black notebook and offered Arthur a look of genuine respect. He assured the older man that he would officially document the home as immaculate and the resident as completely coherent and legally sound. The officer promised to flag the anonymous tip as a malicious and unfounded report to ensure the department could not be used to harass him again. The police officers wished him well and walked back out to their cruiser, leaving Arthur standing on his fortified porch. He watched the patrol car pull away and felt a grim and powerful satisfaction settle over him. His enemies had fired their absolute best psychological weapon and his structural defenses had held perfectly firm. The period of waiting that followed the failed police visit was the most agonizing stretch of time Arthur had endured since the passing of his beloved wife Eleanor. He knew the humiliating defeat at the hands of the local authorities would not deter his daughter-in-law but would only pour gasoline on her burning desperation. The silence of the house stretched on for 3 more days, pressing against the reinforced doors and the heavily locked windows like an invisible storm front gathering strength. The inevitable strike finally arrived on a bleak and overcast Friday afternoon. Arthur was standing by the front window watching the gray clouds roll over the distant mountains when a nondescript white sedan pulled sharply into his driveway. A man wearing a faded windbreaker and carrying a thick manila envelope stepped out of the vehicle and walked briskly up the concrete path. He did not possess the arrogant swagger of the expensive downtown attorney, nor did he wear the authoritative uniform of the city police. He was simply a municipal ghost performing a deeply clinical transaction. Arthur unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and opened the front door before the stranger could even raise his hand to knock. The man paused and asked to confirm the identity of Arthur Thomas Pendleton. When Arthur offered a single tight nod, the man thrust the heavy envelope forward and stated plainly that Arthur had been officially served. The messenger turned on his heel and walked rapidly back to his car without another word, leaving Arthur standing on the cold porch holding the physical manifestation of his son's ultimate betrayal. Arthur closed the door and locked it securely before walking slowly into the dining room. He set the thick envelope down on the polished mahogany table and stared at it for a long moment as if it were an active explosive device. He went to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of ice water and took a long, slow drink to calm the sudden erratic hammering of his heart. He returned to the table and slid his calloused thumb under the heavy paper flap, tearing it open with a harsh ripping sound that echoed loudly in a quiet room. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents securely bound by thick metal staples and topped with the official embossed seal of the county probate court. The bold black letters across the top of the first page read "Petition for the appointment of a permanent guardian." The names of the primary petitioners printed just below the title were Marcus Daniel Pendleton and Chloe Elizabeth Pendleton. Arthur pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket and forced himself to read every single word of the deeply fabricated narrative his own family had sworn under the penalty of perjury. The sheer audacity of the lies printed on the heavy bonded paper was completely suffocating. The petition painted a grotesque and entirely fictional portrait of an aging man who was rapidly descending into the terrifying depths of severe dementia. The document claimed that Arthur was suffering from extreme paranoia and had begun viciously attacking his loving family members without provocation. It listed his completely rational decision to close his bank accounts as a sudden and terrifying display of erratic financial self-destruction. Arthur turned the thick pages and found an entire section dedicated to manipulated witness statements and carefully curated fabrications. There was a signed affidavit from a disgruntled vendor whom Chloe had explicitly instructed to describe Arthur as hostile and deeply confused during a brief interaction over the coffee shop patio heaters. There were deliberately twisted anecdotes claiming Arthur was living in dangerous squalor and neglecting his basic hygiene and refusing to allow anyone inside his home to assist him. They had somehow managed to spin his newly installed security deadbolts into official evidence of a severe paranoid delusion. Every single sentence was a calculated and poisonous lie designed to trick a busy probate judge into stripping Arthur of his fundamental human rights and handing the keys of his estate directly to his abusers. A heavy and suffocating silence filled the dining room as Arthur reached the final page of the extensive petition. He took off his reading glasses and set them gently on the table beside the stack of legal documents. For a fleeting and agonizing moment, the crushing weight of the betrayal threatened to completely break him. The residual grief of losing his only child swelled in his chest as he tried to comprehend how the little boy he had raised could sign his name to such a deeply evil and destructive document. He closed his eyes and remembered the thousands of hours he had spent working overtime to pay for his son's education and the countless sacrifices he and Eleanor had made to ensure the boy never lacked a single necessity. That deep sorrow washed over him like a bitter tide, but it did not last. As Arthur opened his eyes and looked down at the fabricated signatures of his son and his daughter-in-law, the grief completely evaporated into the quiet air. It was instantly and permanently replaced by a pure and absolute tactical fury. He was no longer a mourning father weeping over the ghost of a lost son. He was a man standing on a battlefield, and he had just been handed the official declaration of war. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone to call Sarah Jenkins, knowing exactly what needed to be done next. Arthur drove straight from his dining room table to the modest brick building that housed the law office of Sarah Jenkins. The heavy manila envelope sat on the passenger seat of his truck like a captured enemy flag. When he walked into her office and placed the thick stack of fabricated legal documents on her sturdy wooden desk, Sarah did not look surprised. She spent 30 minutes reading through the perjured statements and the manipulated witness accounts while her jaw set into a hard and unforgiving line. When she finally looked up, her dark eyes were practically burning with professional outrage. She told Arthur that his son and daughter-in-law had chosen to play a very dangerous game with the probate court, and they were about to discover the catastrophic consequences of committing perjury. Sarah opened a fresh manila folder and began outlining their meticulous and aggressive counter-offensive. They were not simply going to defend Arthur against the baseless accusations. They were going to systematically dismantle every single lie and expose the petitioners for exactly what they were. The very first pillar of their defense required absolute and undeniable proof of his mental clarity. The following morning, Arthur found himself sitting in the quiet and warmly lit office of Dr. Robert Harrison, who was a leading forensic psychiatrist specializing in geriatric cognitive function. Sarah had specifically bypassed the court-appointed doctors to hire a man whose medical reputation was entirely bulletproof. Dr. Harrison spent 3 grueling hours subjecting Arthur to a battery of rigorous cognitive tests and psychological evaluations. They discussed the painful history of the coffee shop and the massive financial drain and the devastating emotional betrayal of the grand opening. The doctor did not treat him with the patronizing pity that Julian Vance had attempted to weaponize. Instead, he listened with sharp medical precision. When the exhaustive evaluation was finally complete, Dr. Harrison closed his notebook and offered a firm and respectful handshake. He told Arthur that his mind was not only completely sound, but his cognitive processing was sharper and more resilient than most 40-year-old men he examined. The doctor promised to deliver a sworn medical affidavit that would utterly annihilate the fabricated claims of paranoia and dementia. With his mental competence legally secured, Arthur and Sarah turned their relentless focus toward the paper trail. They needed to prove that the erratic financial behavior mentioned in the petition belonged entirely to Marcus and Chloe. Arthur returned to his local bank branch and sat down once again with David Sterling. The branch manager was deeply appalled to hear about the guardianship petition and immediately agreed to help. He printed out 3 years of detailed transaction logs proving that every single emergency withdrawal and frantic wire transfer had gone directly into the Apex Roasters operating account. Sterling signed a sworn statement confirming that Arthur had closed the accounts with complete lucidity to stop his son from bleeding his retirement dry. They added this irrefutable financial evidence to the growing counter dossier alongside the official transcripts from the utility company. The audio recordings and digital logs proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Chloe had fraudulently impersonated Arthur to shut off his power in a desperate bid to manufacture a crisis. The final phase of their preparation involved gathering the voices of the people who had witnessed the truth firsthand. Officer Ramirez happily submitted a copy of his official police report from the anonymous wellness check. The detailed police log explicitly described Arthur's home as immaculate and his demeanor as perfectly rational, while officially flagging the anonymous phone call as a malicious attempt at familial harassment. Next, Arthur approached his neighbor Martha Higgins, who did not hesitate for a single second when asked to formally testify. She sat in Sarah Jenkins' office and bravely signed a legal affidavit detailing the exact cruel conversations she had overheard in the driveway. Her sworn testimony about Chloe calling Arthur a senile cash cow provided the vital proof of their malicious intent and their premeditated financial predation. Over the course of 14 exhausting days, the empty manila folder on Sarah's desk transformed into a massive and impenetrable fortress of concrete truth. They had gathered banking records and utility logs and police reports and flawless medical evaluations and devastating witness testimonies. Arthur sat in the law office on a quiet Friday afternoon looking at the towering stack of evidence they had meticulously assembled. The suffocating fear and the bitter grief that had threatened to crush him when he first opened the served petition were completely gone. He looked at Sarah Jenkins and felt a profound sense of mutual readiness. They had built a bulletproof shield against the paper lies his son had cowardly hidden behind. Marcus and Chloe had built their entire legal strategy on the arrogant assumption that an aging widower would simply panic and surrender under the overwhelming pressure of a courtroom threat. They had severely miscalculated the strength of the foundation they were trying to destroy. Arthur was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued or a forgotten father begging for basic respect. He was a fully armed man standing on the high ground, and he was absolutely ready for the war to begin. The afternoon before the probate hearing arrived with a crisp and cloudless blue sky over the sprawling Denver suburbs. The frantic and consuming energy of gathering legal evidence and fighting back the invasive maneuvers of the past 2 weeks had finally settled into a deep and resonant quiet inside the Pendleton home. Arthur walked out the back door of his fortified house and stepped down into the modest backyard, breathing in the sharp autumn air. He bypassed the immaculate lawn and headed straight for the large rectangular plot of dark earth tucked along the wooden privacy fence. This was Eleanor's garden, and it had been her personal sanctuary during the difficult years of her illness before remaining Arthur's quiet place of reflection ever since her passing. The early winter frost had long since killed back the delicate summer blooms, leaving behind a tangled web of brittle stalks and overgrown weeds that desperately needed to be cleared away before the spring fall. He pulled a pair of heavy canvas work gloves over his calloused hands and picked up his rusted iron pruning shears. The physical act of kneeling into cold dirt and working the earth with his own 2 hands felt incredibly grounding after weeks of navigating the sterile and treacherous landscapes of banks and law offices. He worked methodically along the edge of the flower beds, cutting away the dead wood and pulling the invasive weeds up by their stubborn and twisting roots. As the sharp blades of the shears snapped through the thick and lifeless branches, Arthur felt a strange and profound parallel between the overgrown garden and his own fractured family. For over 3 years he had allowed the toxic and suffocating vines of Marcus and Chloe's boundless greed to wrap completely around his life. He had stood by passively and watched as their entitlement choked out the healthy roots of his quiet retirement and drained the vital financial resources he had spent decades carefully cultivating. He realized with absolute and unforgiving clarity that allowing a diseased branch to remain attached to a tree did not magically save the dying branch, but merely slowly poisoned the entire healthy trunk. He gripped a particularly stubborn knot of dead bramble and pulled it free from the damp soil, tossing it onto the growing pile of discarded organic debris. The garden did not look barren or defeated without the overgrown mess dragging it down. It simply looked clean and open and entirely ready for new and healthy growth. Arthur sat back on his heels and wiped a bead of sweat from his weathered brow, letting the cool breeze wash over his face. He looked at the empty space he had just cleared and allowed his mind to drift back to the early days of Marcus's childhood. He and Eleanor had loved their only son with a fierce and protective devotion that often bordered on absolute blindness. They had wanted to shield the boy from the harsh economic realities and the bitter daily struggles they had both endured during their own difficult youths. Arthur realized with a heavy and sorrowful sigh that his endless financial generosity had not been a true act of paternal love, but rather a deeply misguided disservice to the boy he was trying to raise. By constantly rushing in with his open checkbook to smooth over every single mistake and fund every passing whim, he had effectively stolen his son's ability to learn resilience. He had paid $54,200 to completely insulate Marcus from the natural consequences of his own foolish and arrogant actions. He had inadvertently built a padded cell of extreme privilege that prevented his son from ever developing the strong moral spine required to be a decent and honorable man. That profound realization did not bring a fresh wave of bitter tears or a crushing sense of heavy parental guilt. Instead, it brought a pure and absolute grounding peace that settled deep into the marrow of his tired bones. Arthur finally understood that the impending courtroom battle was not just about protecting his own financial assets or seeking petty revenge for a missed grand opening invitation. It was the absolute ultimate act of tough love. By standing firm against the malicious guardianship petition and allowing the legal system to expose their terrible lies in the cold light of day, he was finally giving Marcus the one thing the boy desperately needed but had never earned. He was giving his son the terrifying gift of a harsh and undeniable consequence. Arthur took off his canvas work gloves and pressed his bare hands flat against the cold and solid earth. He closed his eyes and felt the steady and enduring strength of the ground beneath him. He whispered a quiet word of thanks to Eleanor's memory, feeling her gentle and protective presence standing right beside him in the garden. The heavy ghosts of obligation and the suffocating chains of unearned loyalty were finally broken, leaving him completely free. As the late afternoon sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long and vibrant streaks of orange across the sky, Arthur gathered his tools and walked back inside the house. He scrubbed the dark soil from his hands and face under the warm running water of the kitchen sink, washing away the last lingering remnants of his former passive life. He walked down the quiet hallway to his master bedroom and opened the heavy wooden doors of his closet. He bypassed the casual denim work shirts and the comfortable flannel sweaters, reaching instead into the back corner to retrieve a long black garment bag. He unzipped the dark canvas to reveal a pristine charcoal gray suit, perfectly pressed and hanging in quiet waiting. It was the exact suit he had worn on the saddest day of his life, when he stood beside Eleanor's open grave and wept for the beautiful future they had lost. He carried the suit to the bed and laid it out with slow and deliberate care, smoothing out the fine woolen fabric. He retrieved the crisp white button-down shirt and a deep navy blue silk tie, placing them neatly beside the tailored jacket. He spent 20 minutes polishing his black leather dress shoes until they gleamed with a perfect mirror finish in the fading light. The dark clothing spread across the mattress no longer represented a heavy mourning of the past. It had been completely transformed into a hardened suit of armor forged specifically for the defining battle of his future. Arthur turned off the bedside lamp and lay down in the dark, feeling perfectly calm and entirely ready for the dawn. The morning of the probate hearing arrived with a biting chill that perfectly matched the sterile atmosphere of the downtown Denver courthouse. Arthur walked through the heavy glass doors wearing his charcoal gray suit and carrying the absolute certainty of his cause. Sarah Jenkins walked confidently beside him, carrying the heavy briefcase that held the concrete truth of their defense. They navigated the polished marble corridors and entered the assigned courtroom, taking their seats at the heavy oak defense table. The room was deathly quiet and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. A few moments later, the heavy wooden doors swung open and the opposition finally arrived. Marcus and Chloe walked down the center aisle, flanked by their expensive attorney Julian Vance. Marcus was wearing a brand new navy suit and a carefully rehearsed expression of deep solemnity, while Chloe was dressed in subdued dark colors to play the role of the exhausted and deeply concerned daughter-in-law. They did not look at Arthur as they took their seats at the petitioner table, but the thick and suffocating tension in the room was completely undeniable. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Harper, and the entire courtroom rose in unison. She was a stern woman with sharp silver hair and piercing eyes who had presided over the probate court for nearly 2 decades. She settled into her high leather chair and immediately called the hearing to order with a swift strike of her wooden gavel. Julian Vance was the first to rise and approach the podium. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and launched into a deeply theatrical opening statement. He painted a tragic and heart-wrenching portrait of an aging widower who was rapidly losing his battle against severe cognitive decline. He spoke in low and sympathetic tones as he described Arthur isolating himself behind new deadbolts and completely alienating the only family members who truly cared about his well-being. Vance boldly claimed that his clients were simply trying to perform a loving intervention before Arthur could completely destroy his own financial security. Arthur sat perfectly still at the defense table, keeping his hands folded neatly in his lap and his face completely devoid of any readable emotion. He listened to the slick attorney weave a tapestry of absolute poison and felt nothing but a cold and calculated patience. The true spectacle began when Vance officially called Marcus to the witness stand. Arthur watched his only son swear an oath on the Holy Bible to tell the absolute truth before sitting down in the wooden witness box. Marcus leaned forward and immediately launched into an award-winning performance of profound filial sorrow. He rubbed his eyes and let his voice crack with manufactured emotion as he spun a fictional tale of watching his beloved father slip away into the dark shadows of dementia. He blatantly lied to the judge about Arthur becoming increasingly hostile and forgetting basic conversations and making catastrophic financial decisions without any logical reason. Marcus claimed that the sudden closure of the joint banking accounts was not an act of boundaries but a terrifying symptom of a diseased mind desperately lashing out at the people trying to help. He looked directly at Judge Harper and pleaded with her to grant the guardianship so he could finally protect his vulnerable father from himself. It was a sickeningly convincing display of fake grief that would have absolutely broken the heart of any parent who did not already know the exact price of the tears. Chloe was called to the stand immediately after her husband, and she delivered her perjured testimony with the smooth and chilling precision of a practiced predator. She did not feign tears but instead adopted the posture of a weary and deeply frightened caregiver. She testified under oath that Arthur had become incredibly paranoid and completely unhinged over the past several weeks. She twisted the reality of her own malicious utility sabotage to claim that Arthur was failing to pay his basic bills and was dangerously close to losing his own home. She brought up the newly installed security locks and falsely framed them as undeniable evidence of a severe psychotic break. Chloe looked the judge right in the eyes and solemnly declared that Arthur was no longer safe living alone and desperately required their immediate legal intervention. She spoke with such unwavering confidence and fabricated sincerity that the courtroom air felt thick with her toxic deception. Throughout the entire elaborate performance, Arthur did not flinch or shake his head or utter a single word of protest. He sat beside Sarah Jenkins with the unyielding posture of a mountain staring down a violent winter storm. He was watching his own flesh and blood commit blatant perjury to legally steal his life, and yet he did not feel the crushing despair they so desperately wanted to inflict. He simply watched the intricate illusion being carefully constructed layer by layer, knowing exactly how fragile the entire structure truly was. He knew that Julian Vance and his deceitful clients had built their entire legal strategy on the arrogant assumption that an aging man would possess absolutely no concrete evidence to contradict their emotional lies. Arthur took a slow and measured breath as the opposition finally rested their fabricated case. The courtroom fell into a heavy and expectant silence as Judge Harper turned her sharp gaze toward the defense table. The elaborate stage had been completely set by the predators, but it was finally time for the supposed prey to unleash the absolute truth. Sarah Jenkins stood up as the heavy silence stretched across the courtroom following the desperate testimonies of the petitioners. She did not possess the theatrical flair of her opposing counsel, but her presence was commanding and steeped in absolute authority. She addressed Judge Harper with a clear and unwavering voice, stating that the court had just been subjected to a highly orchestrated masterclass in perjury and elder financial abuse. Jenkins explained that the petition before the court was not an act of familial love or a protective medical intervention, but rather a malicious weapon forged by two people who were furious that their endless financial supply had finally been cut off. The slick confidence on Julian Vance's face faltered for the very first time as Sarah called her first witness to the stand. Dr. Robert Harrison walked to the wooden box with the quiet dignity of a man whose medical expertise was entirely beyond reproach and absolutely immune to intimidation. Dr. Harrison swore his oath and took his seat before adjusting his glasses and opening his meticulous medical file. He testified that he had subjected Arthur to an exhaustive battery of forensic cognitive evaluations and complex psychological assessments. His voice echoed through the silent courtroom as he completely obliterated the fabricated narrative of dementia and paranoia that Marcus had tearfully presented. He stated unequivocally that Arthur Pendleton possessed a cognitive sharpness and emotional resilience that surpassed the vast majority of adults half his age. The doctor looked directly at Marcus and Chloe while declaring that the accusations in their legal petition were not only medically unfounded but were completely and laughably absurd. He explained that Arthur's decision to install heavy security locks and sever his financial ties were the perfectly rational defense mechanisms of a fully lucid man who had finally recognized he was being actively exploited by predators. Marcus swallowed hard and sank an inch lower in his wooden chair as the entire foundation of their medical deception collapsed into dust. Sarah Jenkins barely gave the opposition time to recover their breath before calling David Sterling to the stand. The polished branch manager presented the official banking records and meticulously detailed the staggering sum of $54,200 that had been funneled directly into the Apex Roasters operating accounts over the past 3 years. He testified that Arthur had visited the bank completely alone and entirely lucid to calmly sever those financial arteries just hours after being humiliated and excluded from his own son's grand opening event. Sterling confirmed under oath that the erratic financial ruin mentioned in the petition belonged exclusively to Marcus and Chloe, who were currently defaulting on their massive commercial debts. Officer Ramirez followed the banker to the stand and delivered the final crushing blow to their carefully curated character assassination. The tall police officer recounted the anonymous and highly malicious wellness check describing Arthur's home as immaculate and his demeanor as perfectly rational. He explicitly informed the judge that the desperate phone call had been officially flagged by the police department as a documented instance of targeted familial harassment and coercion. The oppressive atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely from a tense trial into a methodical execution of the truth. Sarah Jenkins turned toward the defense table and quietly called Arthur to the stand. He stood up slowly and buttoned his charcoal gray suit jacket before walking to the wooden witness box with the heavy and purposeful strides of a man reclaiming his own sovereign life. He swore the sacred oath and sat down, folding his calloused hands neatly in front of him. Arthur did not raise his voice to match the frantic emotional performance his son had delivered an hour earlier. He spoke with a quiet and devastating dignity that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He recounted the painful phone call on the night of the grand opening and the cruel realization that he was only useful for his checkbook but never worthy of standing among the important people. He explained his methodical audit of the 3 years of financial abuse and his ultimate realization that his unconditional generosity had completely stunted his son's moral growth. Arthur looked directly at the sharp silver-haired judge and stated clearly that he did not hate his son, but he absolutely refused to be his financial hostage for another single day. He explained that a father's love should not require him to surrender his own dignity or empty his retirement savings to fund the hollow and arrogant illusion built on disrespect. When Arthur finally finished speaking, a profound and heavy silence blanketed the entire courtroom. Judge Harper sat perfectly still behind her elevated wooden bench with her hands steepled together over the massive stack of irrefutable evidence Sarah Jenkins had provided. Her previously neutral and clinical expression had completely vanished into the quiet air. She slowly turned her sharp and piercing gaze away from Arthur and locked her eyes directly onto Marcus and Chloe. The look on the veteran judge's face was no longer one of impartial observation, but one of absolute and terrifying judicial wrath. The carefully constructed empire of lies had been entirely burned to the ground, and the perpetrators were finally trapped in the blinding light of the ashes. Judge Harper adjusted her heavy silver reading glasses and stared down at the petitioners with an expression of absolute judicial disgust that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. She broke the heavy and suffocating silence with a voice that rang out like a striking anvil echoing against the polished wood paneling. She stated unequivocally that the probate court took guardianship petitions incredibly seriously because they were designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society by transferring their fundamental human autonomy. She declared that after thoroughly reviewing the flawless medical evaluations and the undeniable banking records, she found absolutely zero evidence of cognitive decline or financial incompetence on the part of Arthur Pendleton. Marcus flinched physically as the judge spoke those words, and Chloe completely drained of color as the crushing reality of their impending failure began to set in. Judge Harper then lifted the massive stack of fabricated documents submitted by the petitioners and dropped it back onto her desk with a loud and final thud. She looked directly into the eyes of the young couple and told them that she had never seen a more flagrant and malicious abuse of the judicial system in her entire career on the bench. The veteran judge leaned forward and delivered the final devastating blow to their carefully constructed scheme. She announced that she was not only categorically denying the guardianship petition, but she was officially referring Marcus and Chloe Pendleton to Adult Protective Services and the local district attorney for a comprehensive criminal investigation. She explicitly cited the fraudulent utility requests and the fabricated police wellness checks and the documented $54,200 they had drained from a vulnerable family member. Julian Vance immediately jumped to his feet and began to stammer a weak professional protest, but a single sharp strike of the wooden gavel silenced the expensive attorney instantly. Judge Harper warned him that any further disruptions would result in his own professional conduct being heavily scrutinized by the State Bar Association. The hearing was officially adjourned, and the elaborate illusion of their entitlement was permanently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Arthur stood up from the defense table and buttoned his charcoal gray suit jacket, feeling a profound and weightless sense of absolute vindication wash over his tired soul. He shook Sarah Jenkins by the hand and thanked her for her brilliant and relentless defense before turning to walk out of the heavy wooden doors. As Arthur stepped into the bright and polished marble corridor of the courthouse, he heard the familiar sound of his son's voice calling out his name. Marcus hurried down the hallway looking incredibly small and entirely stripped of his previous arrogant swagger. Chloe stood several paces behind him with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, looking absolutely terrified as she watched her comfortable elite lifestyle completely evaporate before her eyes. Marcus stopped a few feet away from his father with tears welling in his eyes and offered a desperate and frantic apology that sounded more like a panicked plea for mercy. He begged Arthur to help them navigate the impending criminal investigation and the inevitable financial collapse of the coffee shop, pleading that they were still family and they desperately needed his protection. Arthur looked at the broken and desperate man standing before him and felt absolutely no anger or lingering sorrow or parental guilt. He simply shook his head and spoke with a calm and unyielding finality that left absolutely no room for debate. He told his son that he had spent his entire life protecting him from the harsh realities of the world, and it had only turned him into a selfish coward. Arthur stated quietly that the $54,200 was the absolute last safety net they would ever receive from him. He looked deep into Marcus's pleading eyes and told him that it was finally time to grow up and face the severe consequences of his own actions without a wealthy father standing by to catch him when he inevitably fell. Arthur turned his back on his son for the very last time and walked down the long marble corridor and out into the crisp Denver sunlight, leaving them completely alone in the ashes of the empire they had tried to steal. The passing of 6 months brought a beautiful and transformative peace to Arthur's existence that he had not experienced in decades. He placed the quiet suburban house on the market and sold it to a young family who would fill the halls with fresh laughter rather than the heavy ghosts of toxic obligation and bitter betrayal. He took the substantial equity and purchased a vibrant and sunlit loft in the heart of the downtown arts district, surrounded by the bustling energy of the city he had helped build during his long career. He spent his crisp autumn mornings drinking dark roast coffee on his private balcony and his afternoons walking through the historic neighborhoods with a renewed sense of absolute wonder. He purchased a fresh set of expensive drafting pencils and a thick leather-bound sketchbook, slowly returning to his original passion for architectural drawing that he had completely abandoned when he first became a father. He sat by his massive floor-to-ceiling windows, tracing the beautiful geometric lines of the city skyline while feeling Eleanor's gentle and approving presence smiling down on him from whatever peaceful place she now rested. The suffocating chains of unearned loyalty and the heavy burden of his incredibly toxic family were completely gone, leaving him alone but never lonely. He was finally and truly free to live the rest of his golden years exactly as he chose, surrounded by his own quiet strength and the unshakable foundation of a life completely reclaimed.